The Magic of the Swatchways. Chapter 14, and the last one. Changeable Weather. As the old smack took her usual long sweep around and brought the wind aft, the little town that we were leaving looked as though it was still asleep in the morning sunshine. The white mixture of smoke and steam belching forth in rhythmic puffs from a train pulling out of the station was the only indication of life that we could actually see. Nearly 12 years had elapsed since Derek and I had ruthlessly left Woodbridge behind and charged down the river in my 2-ton dabchick before a fierce winter wind. With snow lying on the ground, Woodbridge had appeared inhospitable on that occasion. Since then I'd paid several visits up the delightful winding Deben to the little town, each time, I verily believe, in a different boat. But never had Woodbridge looked so attractive, so unspoilt, with its quaint old tide mill and its sea wall and the houses rising over the hill beyond, as it did on this bright August morning when we weighed our anchor from the secluded little bay at Kyson. The sun shone on the expanse of mudflats that were rapidly being uncovered by the tide as we ran down the aptly named Troublesome Reach, for rarely does the stranger navigate it without making the acquaintance of one or other of its shoal patches and tricky turns. A soft westerly wind rustled the group of trees at the mouth of Martlesham Creek, where we'd spent the night, and caused the long streamer at our masthead to flutter in a scarlet streak against the azure background of the sky. I always covet that house that stands in its garden at Kyson, a good square pile half hidden by trees that peeps down the river nearly as far as Waldringfield. To live comfortably in a place like that, to have one's boat on a mooring on the creek at the bottom of the garden, to keep a dog. "We'll have to jibe soon." The mate's voice recalled me from my daydream, and I walked aft to haul in the heavy mainsail. I hadn't owned Alfrina long, but I'd already learned that although a 12-ton smack yacht can be sailed single-handed under ordinary conditions, there are times when she can be a handful, even for two. Jibing in a fresh breeze is one of them, and there have been times when, being alone, I've run nearly a mile before being able to jibe. Hauling in the 2-inch Manila mainsheet when a fresh breeze is filling the mainsail needs every ounce of one's strength, while the tiller has to be lashed and the boat made to sail herself. Then the weather runner has to be slacked off and the lee runner braced up. Each needs quite a walk round the deck. Then a foot or so of more on the mainsheet and crash! Over she comes, and you have to push the helm hard with all your might to keep the boat from rounding up into the wind. For Alfrina, unlike most boats of her type, is quick on her helm and needs careful steering. For many years this old boat had earned some smackman's living as a Colchester oyster dredger working out of Brightlingsea. Then some yachtsman with an eye for a boat had bought her and converted her into a sturdy and homely, if not exactly smart, yacht. She was a fine vessel for her size, measuring 35 feet overall, 31 feet on the waterline, and 10 foot 3 in beam and 4 foot 6 inches draught. Full-bodied and comparatively shallow, she was just the type of boat that I liked, yet the antithesis of my wife's Juanita. She was roomy and cosy below, with a wide saloon which in cold weather was cheered by a coal stove, and a small separate sleeping cabin aft having 2 spring bunks, while one of her chief virtues, so useful on the coast, was that she would sit upright when aground. Like all boats of her type, she had an immense bowsprit, a 6-inch Oregon pine spar, standing 15 feet beyond the straight stem, which put the fear of God into any yachtsman who thought of crossing our bows a little too close. I was proud of that bowsprit, and kept it well scraped and varnished. "The wind's freshening a bit," said the mate as she stood, her feet wide apart with both hands on the long tiller. It was true. A sudden gust filled the mainsail and caused the old ship to heel slightly, while the water turned over under her lee bow with a gurgle that steadily grew into a joyous roar, while the wooded banks of the river on either side were slipping past at a fine rate. By the time I'd coiled all the halyards and catted the rusty 80-pound anchor in the approved Brittlesea fashion, Waldringfield, a tiny hamlet nesting among the trees on the west bank of the river, was passing. I waved a kiss to the mate and began to wash down the decks. These were no white, spotless decks demanding the deference of soft shoes. They were solid decks, painted with red ochre and linseed oil, giving them a restful, deep red colour, while the inside of the bulwarks were pale bluff, and the timber heads supporting them and the hatches on the deck were emerald green. This bright colour scheme suited the old vessel, and she carried it off well, but I had not yet painted the topmast emerald green too, as I had decided to at Ostend. "Will you take the helm a moment, skipper? I want to put my socks on." I took the tiller until the mate reappeared up the companion with her canvas fisherman's smock, which keeps the wind out better than 3 sweaters. Then I went forward again to lash down the dinghy, which we'd stowed bottom upwards against the starboard rail. We carried it thus, for we were going to sea, and might meet anything between here and, say, the Crouch. After the exhausting holiday to Ostend and Flushing my wife and I had had in a yawl, I declared that the next few days' holiday I got would be spent idling up my beloved creeks and rivers in my own boat, and for 2 days Alfrina had been doing it, but somehow the westerly wind and the ebb tide had called us both on this fine morning, and we prepared the ship for a passage round to Paglesham on the Roach River, both anxious for a good sail with this sturdy old hooker beneath our feet, but we reckoned without the weather of 1931. Past the Long Horse, that treacherous middle ground which was already awash in the centre, and is marked at the upper end only by an absurd little black buoy, the banks became shingle and closed in on either side, leading out past the chain ferry connecting Bawdsey on the north shore to Felixstowe ferry on the south. "Are you going to take a pilot?" With her hair curling out from beneath her beret and her face wearing a grin of sheer joy, the mate nodded towards a collection of wooden bungalows and huts which formed Felixstowe ferry. One of the local pilots was watching us through binoculars, and I didn't dip our streamer. "No, we came in without one, and I'll risk it," I said, taking over the helm. "Woodbridge Haven, as the entrance to the Deben is called, isn't quite so treacherous as Orford Haven, although it has a nasty bar of shingle banks that, after an easterly gale, shift and hump up in unexpected places. This time there was a great bank of shingle, like a flat-topped necropolis, 5 feet high above the low water mark, which formed a small channel to the north of the main one, and as we opened out the ugly-looking line of white crests and troubled water ahead, I couldn't help thinking of that winter's day Derrick and I had nearly wrecked little Dabchick on this bar. The mate swung the lead, which is kept coiled on the deck for immediate use, and said 5½ feet. We were just over the bar on the shallowest part, and with a fair swell running, couldn't have had more than a few inches to spare under our keel in the hollows. But we were safely over, a 6-knot ebb rushing us out past the little black buoy, and the lead line was recoiled and no comment made. The fact is, after several years at this game of cruising, you begin to take it so seriously, and the various experiences and frights make you so cautious that you become too damned efficient and sure of yourself. This necessary cautiousness and careful forethought against emergencies take away a great deal of the uncertainty and adventure which are ever present in one's first cruises. But after saving you for the first year of your yachting career, the little cherub that looks after inexperienced sailors gets tired of you and leaves you to the mercies of old Neptune. He doesn't like people who make mistakes, the irascible old scoundrel, and adventure, like spring, is never far behind. The wind was in our teeth for the Naze, the cliffs of which were nearly hull down, although the eternal Naze Tower, which I'm told was erected in 1720 as a landmark by Trinity House, was plainly visible. The ebb wasn't done yet, and for an hour we thrashed away to windward without making much headway. Then, when the Cork light vessel had turned to the young flood, the seas became steeper, and Alfrina punched her powerful bows through their green faces, so that they tumbled over the rail forward, closing over the bitts and the capstan, as though trying to grasp the ship and hold her down. But always her black bows rose again, and the infuriated water, foaming with rage, was bundled out through the lee scuppers. Harwich Harbour opened out away off our starboard beam, and before long we were off Walton on the Naze, with the tumbling water of the Wallet before us. "The wind's backing," said the mate. "We can't lay the Spitway buoy at all now." Her tone suggested deep resentment, for we'd counted on making a good leg through the Wallet Spitway. I gave an absent-minded reply, for I was below in the saloon, cutting ham and cucumber sandwiches. "The wind's piping up out of this cloud too," she added later, with her mouth too full for words. The wind certainly had freshened. We'd just come about near the edge of Gunfleet Sand, and Afrina was driving hard on the port tack with her lee scuppers awash. Every now and then a heavy lump of green water crashed over her weather bow, rushed along the lee deck and filled the quarter deck to the height of the rail, until it drained away through the scuppers. I took a long look at the sky to windward, for it appeared black and heavy and had already hidden the sun. "I don't think we shall have to reef," I said finally. "It won't be more than a rain squall, and we can just trice up the tack if necessary. Better go about." Afrina went round to the other tack again, with a clattering of canvas and several headlong pitches. Then she was off, heeling well over to port and filling her decks with frenzied water. There was a good deal of water and spray about, and we had by now donned our sea boots and oilskins. The wind was whipping off the crests of the seas, and the spray that was hurled from her lee bow was blown away to leeward in a mist that revealed the suggestion of a rainbow. Then the wind came with a violent squall, a blinding deluge that drove into our straining mainsail with a loud hiss. Afrina lay over still more under the fearful strain, her decks full to the cabin top, staggering under the dead weight of the water. Suddenly a dull thud seemed to shake the whole ship. My beautiful bowsprit was bending like a bow. "Shove her around on the other tack, the bowsprit shroud's carried away." "All right, lee-ho!" Scarcely able to face the blast of blinding rain and stinging spindrift, we put the old ship round onto the port tack once more, and hove her to with the staysail held aweather. "We'll have to get the small jib set and put a couple of reefs in the mainsail," I shouted into the mate's ear. "Help me stow that jib." While we fought the terrific weight of wind in the big jib, it was our largest, or number one, Afrina lay hove to, crashing her great bowsprit into the seas, and lifting her head wildly as they surged under her, doing her best to throw us off the foredeck. By degrees we had the maddened sail down. Then, with a terrific plunge of the ship, it filled with water in a monstrous bag, tore itself loose from our hands, and all but dragged us overboard, bellied out and began to flog in the wind like an immense kite. In my haste to gather it in, for it might burst to ribbons at any moment, I let the outhaul slip through my fingers, but by our extra effort the jib was conquered and lay like a deflated balloon, a sodden mass around the bitts. Then I had to clamber halfway along that wildly dipping bowsprit to retrieve that unspeakable outhaul with a boat hook. We dragged the limp sail aft and stuffed it down the sailroom hatch in the afterdeck. The tanned Spitfire was hauled out and set on the bowsprit. Then I staggered aft again, almost blinded by rain and spray, and hauled down the second reef cringle with the tackle, using, it seemed, my last ounce of strength. When I turned round, panting, my shipmate was grimly tying in the reef pendants. It was blowing harder than ever now, a full summer gale, and the rain was so thick that the cliffs at Frinton, half a mile away, were blotted out. When all the reefing points had been tied and we'd swigged up the peak once more, I sat down on the weather rail and took stock of our position. "Not much use trying to beat into the crouch against this," I bawled into her ear. "Why, we'd have a hell of a dusting even to make the cone with one of our bowsprit shrouds gone. Heaven knows what might carry away next. Better run for Harwich." We had to scandalise the mainsail, lower the peak and trice up the tack a little way to keep the old ship under control as we bore up and steered a compass course for Harwich. Although Walton could not be a mile away, no sign of the Naze was visible, and we tore along in a welter of rain, spray and howling wind, while the crests of the seas alternately lapped over our quarter-deck to run into the lee scuppers, and roared level with our foredeck as they raced us in our mad rush. For a while I sat on the stem-head facing aft, my ears filled with the song of the boiling water tumbling over the bow, while aft I could see the mate, bracing herself in her sea boots against the heeling of the ship, tugging at the tiller lines, her face almost hidden by the collar of her oilskin. But her face wore a wide grin of exultation that said, "To hell with the weather, this is grand sailing." While on the foredeck, I fished up with the boat hook the bowsprit shroud which had carried away, and found that it wasn't the wire shroud which had parted, nor yet the hempen lanyard, but the shroud plate which had pulled clean out of the ship's side. As I bent over to feel what damage had been done, for the place was under water all the time, my fingers detected a hole in her side through which a bolt had been drawn, and it suddenly dawned on me that water must be pouring in. The sight that met our eyes as I pushed back the after cabin hatch was shocking. The carpet in the saloon was floating in 2 inches of water over the floorboards. Several books had jumped out of the bookshelf and joined it, and a drawer under the port berth had fallen open and was full of seawater, with some of my clothes floating in it. I stuffed a rag in the hole in the bow, having to reach down into the hissing race of the bow wave to do so, then returned aft to pump the ship dry. "We'll light the stove as soon as we get in," I said ruefully, "and dry our things. Heavens, what a summer!" Almost without warning the rain ceased. The wind eased off appreciably, and the grey heaving waters turned to sparkling green and flashing white as the sun suddenly broke through the clouds. The storm cloud passed away to leeward, a black ominous mass, and as it went the land suddenly appeared through its grey skirt of rain. And soon the beach and promenade and the distant pier of Felixstowe had passed through the gloom into the sunshine like a stage scene where the curtain is drawn aside. Having set up the peak of the mainsail and hauled down the tack, I came aft and took the helm, bringing the ship's head round to port so that her bowsprit pointed across the Pye Sands. The mate looked puzzled. "Aren't you going to Harwich?" "No, up to an old anchorage at the top of Hamford Water," I explained. "We can repair our shroud lanyard up there in peace." The wind, still blowing freshly but not so hard as in the squall, allowed us to fetch across the middle of the sands with a few inches under our keel, for the flood had been making more than 3 hours now into the channel that leads up between them and the Dovercourt shore. At Island Point, where the channel branches to port and continues a mile or so up to the Walton clubhouse, we carried on up Hamford Water and let go our rusty anchor at the very top, close to my old anchorage, which I discovered in Swan. Some hours later the mate and I stood at the end of the Forgotten Hard on the fringe of the little island called Horsey, looking in mute wonder up the tranquil Hamford Water towards the flaming sunset that was lighting up the whole of the sky. We held a loaf of bread and a can of fresh milk, for our visit to the solitary farm on this lonely island of pasture and dykes and sea walls had been made to replenish our stores. Neither spoke, for the wind had dropped and scarcely a breath came to ruffle the surface of the water. Old Afrena lay quiet at the head of the creek, her scarlet streamer hanging limp and the smoke from her stove chimney trailing upwards in growing spirals. The sun sank lower. Far away behind us, in the direction from which we'd come, we could just make out Dovercourt with its tall chimney, and beyond the church of All Saints at Felixstowe, raised as by a mirage. Some 2 miles across these islands towards the south, across the wades that separated them from the mainland, the town of Walton was just visible, while towards the setting sun lay another mile of winding creeks and little sedge-covered islands with here and there a quaint group of trees, uninhabited stretches of wild open scenery. The Hard was covered with several inches of soft slippery mud, and wearing sea boots I swept the mate up in my arms and carried her down to the dinghy. "Do you think the Vikings ever landed on this old Hard?" she muttered, "like this?" We launched the dinghy and rowed quietly towards the old homely smack, pausing on the oars occasionally to listen to the call of the redshank or a peewit from over the marshes, while the drips fell from the blades of the oars and made silent rings in the water. "I don't wonder that you're fascinated by these wild places," my shipmate remarked at last, in an undertone, gazing about her. "There's something mysterious about these deserted creeks and tiny islands that you never get in the Solent. There's probably not another living soul within miles of us. Yet just think of the crowds that must be hurrying home on the roads tonight. There's scarcely a sound, is there?" I nodded towards our sturdy home, while the reflection of her mast, with its limp red pennant inverted, quivered and writhed lazily in the water. "Only one boat at a time ought to anchor in a place like this. A crowd would spoil the magic." "Yes, and the silence of these creeks," she whispered. Well, thanks for sticking with me through this book. It's one of my favourites. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please chip in. If you didn't, why are you still here? Here's a picture. And here's a picture of his. Here's a picture of his boat in the storm. He loves storms. And here's a picture. Here's the last picture of the book. Magic of Swatchways, still in print. Bloke's dead now, so sun. Giving him money is not going to keep him sailing. Giving me some will do.